Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Mark Brunson. He's a professor in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University, where he's worked since 1992. He's not that old. Sorry, Mark. 1992, after earning his doctorate at Oregon State University. Certainly a lot of Oregon flavor in today's presentation. His teaching and research activities focus on understanding people's perception and behaviors towards natural ecosystems, in particular rangelands, and how these might be influenced to improve natural resource stewardship. He's one of the principal investigators of SageSteppe, a 5-year multidisciplinary study that is evaluating alternative options for restoration of sagebrush communities throughout the Great Basin. And his presentation today will draw heavily on the early findings of the SageSteppe project. As an ecologist in College of Natural Resources here at Utah State, we really appreciate what the perspectives that Mark brings in terms of the human dimensions and the importance of humans on the landscape and effects on the landscape. And you'll see some of that perspective today. And I think it's something that many of us as ecologists oftentimes forget, is this human dimensions component is extremely important. Mark's presentation is entitled Sagebrush Steppe Restoration from a Social Science Perspective.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ron, and I do appreciate the kind words. I've been doing this for quite a long time, working as a social scientist amongst ecologists and natural resource managers. And for a while, I used to feel somewhat alone. But increasingly, I'm really feeling that a lot of people understand the kinds of issues that we're talking about. But still, there's a little bit of a yin-yang kind of thing going on, and we designed that in the organization of this session. So Steve spoke about the ecology side, and now my role is to bring us over, I guess, to the dark side. And in so doing, I actually had at this point in my head what I was going to say was something along the lines of the social context is where it all happens. Well, what Steve told us is that ecological success is where it all happens. And in fact, he's right. We can't possibly have any kind of success in restoring sagebrush steppe ecosystems unless we are able to understand the ecology of the system. And I would argue that I was also right. And Steve also told us that it's all about context. And the context in which management and restoration occurs is essentially the human context and the larger society in which these activities have to be implemented. So I'd like to talk about that today. So I've got 4 parts to this talk. So the first part is to simply a little bit describe what I mean by the human dimensions of sagebrush restoration. I am going to present some research results that were gathered as part of the SageSteppe large-scale research program, which Steve Kinnick is also an investigator on, and a number of other speakers that you'll hear from today. And then I want to talk a little bit about the gradations, the sort of, what I'm going to call the shades of gray in societal preferences, because I think we have a tendency to try and, just as we have a tendency to characterize sagebrush habitats as being somewhat the same, when in fact they're different, and it's very important that they're different. The same is true when we try and characterize the people that we interact with in the course of trying to manage sagebrush systems. And then finally, I'm moving here from data to data-informed theoretical sort of statements to sheer speculation. I'm going to try and end with a little bit about what I think all of this is going to mean for us. So to think first about the human dimension, I worked out this kind of hokey diagram to try and describe the different ways in which, as resource managers or as natural scientists, we might be interested in understanding what the social context is, what the human dimensions are, and how it's going to affect our ability to achieve success. So if we sort of go on a scale from the shallowest amount of participation and the most infrequent or briefest in any given time amount of participation, at that lowest level, what we're really interested in is awareness. And we move up on the scale from the next group of people. Awareness is really what we expect of the general public. Every citizen out there, we kind of like them to understand that this is an issue. Acceptance is the next level up, and it's a little narrow in terms of how much of society we think we need to be able to focus on this. And this is what we might call the interested public. So these are citizens, for example, who, if the general public are the people whose viewing mechanisms shut off when they leave Salt Lake toward Reno, they get somewhere out on the salt flats, and then they say, well, there's nothing to look at until you get to Reno. The interested public are the ones who notice that there is, in fact, something to look at. There's some variability, and yes, a lot of it is sagebrush, but a lot of it isn't. And less of it all the time. And then the next group up might be the involved public. And these are the people who not only are interested, but they take action. And so where the interested public, we might want them to have some acceptance of the kinds of practices and methods, management strategies that might be in place on sagebrush landscapes, for those involved publics, for stakeholder groups, for people who might be interested in volunteering on a project. For them, we want action. Or in some cases, we'd really like the absence of action that's being taken to impede what we're doing. And then finally, at the level of the managing public, and I'm including both the managers of public lands but also of private lands, now we would like to see adoption. We're interested in understanding the factors that influence whether people will adopt the kinds of practices and the kinds of management strategies that are likely to both restore and sustain sagebrush steppe systems over that 100 years or more that Steve told us about. So let's look at these in time. What are we really talking about? Well, from awareness standpoint, if we look at the lowest, the general public level, we really just want people to understand that a threat exists. And these are two slides that I borrowed from Steve's shop, and they basically, I like them because you can look out and the red and the yellow leaps out at you. And these are basically descriptions modeling the risk that sagebrush or sagebrush bunchgrass communities would be displaced on your left by pinyon pine or juniper encroachment, and on the right by cheatgrass as a displacing agent. And so, if we're able to show that to citizens, and they say, oh gosh, look at all this red, look at all this yellow, I understand that there's something going on out there, and that maybe some resources. It's a widespread problem. It's a significant problem, and probably some resources should be allocated to it. And that may be all we ask of the general public. And so, at some level, that's really what we're interested in understanding. Are people aware of this? At the next level, at the level of acceptance, when we start to get into the interested public, we're looking at something a little bit different. We not only want them to be aware of the problem, but because we know they are interested, because we know they will be noticing those impacts that occur in terms of restoration, and in many cases those are going to have some potentially negative appearing consequences for some period of time. We want them to also accept the practices and conditions that restoration is likely to entail. And depending on the situation, that might be fire, it might mean mechanical treatment, it might mean herbicide, and we would really like people who are watching, who are noticing, to understand enough about the problem to be able to understand why somebody would be using those practices. And so, as a social scientist, what I want to know is what is the level of acceptance that's out there. As we narrow down now to the involved public, what we really like to know about the involved public is, are they aware, are they accepting, and will they take action or refrain from taking opposing action when it appears, when the best judgment of all the stakeholders and the science expertise says when it's required. And so again, here we have some examples. We've got folks involved in a monitoring program in California on one side, and we've got a sort of an education program in Nevada, and actually a weed pulling program in Oregon, all of which are ways of action, places where we might be interested in understanding, will people act, under what circumstances will they act, what kinds of action are they likely to take, and what are the kinds of understandings would be more likely to encourage them to take the kinds of actions that seem to be indicated. And finally, at the smallest level, at the top, the peak of our pyramid, We want the managers of both public and private land to be aware. We want to know if they understand, they accept, they're active, and that they will make long-term changes. And in some cases, that means changing more than simply what they do with respect to Sagebrush, but changing the whole system in which they approach management. And so this is a more difficult challenge, but it's also going to probably have to be part of the solution. If we sort of look at the scale, the way that Steve presented the scale issue, this is where the time scale comes in the social and the human dimension. So I did want to mention briefly the Sage Step project because I've already said that that's who's responsible for a lot of the work that I'm doing. Basically, our overall goal is to conduct research that can provide for information that will make restoration decisions more certain, reduce the risk, reduce the uncertainty. And so we're doing this by a region-wide field experiment with really broad multidisciplinary inquiry. And we're going to look at trade-offs among alternative options for restoration. So we've got this network of sites extending from central Washington down to southwestern Utah. I think there's 20, I've seen another count of 21 different sites, all of which are undergoing a transition either from a sagebrush bunchgrass communities to woodland or to exotic annual grassland. So these are the kinds of places that we're talking about when we're talking about the need for restoration or the threat. Maybe they're priority sites. And what we're doing is we're experimentally treating these places and then we're studying as many different things as we could find people to study within the budget, which is really quite extraordinarily large. So we've got people looking at vegetation response. We have wildlife. So Steve's crews are out there looking at the interesting dynamic woodland bird species. We're not doing sage-grouse work. And we've got various kinds of insect studies going on out there. We've got physical science, and we've got a component of economic and social science as well. And my role actually is to be the non-economic social science program lead. So I have the various kinds of sociological stuff, and I've also got outreach. So what does that mean, socio-political research under SageStep? Well, our initial phase, which began last year, we had two different studies, which I'll talk about more today. Interviews of stakeholders and managers, and that's really focused on the levels of adoption and action. And then we've got a baseline general public survey, which is really focused on the levels of awareness and acceptance. And then we've got a bunch of other projects underway or about to go underway. We just started a content analysis of interest group statements and in legal actions and websites, basically to sort of triangulate different kinds of messages that they might provide to different people. We're going to repeat our baseline survey that we completed last year. We're going to repeat in 2 counties in Utah because they just burned up. And we're interested in knowing whether the Milford Flat Fire affected how people feel about sagebrush step, their awareness and their understanding and their acceptance. We're going to analyze laws and regulations regarding practices associated with restoration on public and private lands. We're going to do a permittee survey, and we're going to go back and repeat the whole social acceptability survey in about 3 years to see how stable or unstable our the general public and interested public statements and understanding might be. But for now, I really want to focus on what came on in the initial phase. So these 2 different studies that I got involved with, one of them is this baseline general public survey. And Bruce Schindler at Oregon State and I worked on this together. He actually took the lead. His PhD student was the one administering the survey. And there we were, as I said, focusing on understanding awareness and acceptance. What we did is we surveyed randomly selected persons in the 3 largest metro areas in the Great Basin region, so Boise, Reno, and Salt Lake, and then 3 2-county rural areas, Lake and Harney counties in Oregon, Millard and Beaver counties in Utah, as I mentioned, and Elko and White Pine counties in Nevada. And the reasons we chose those are not, partly because they're representative, partly because they have about the same population, so it's a sampling deal, and partly because we have treatment sites, we have experimental sites in all 6 of those counties as part of our SageStep project. So we really wanted to understand what citizens in those particular locations thought. And then at the same time as we were launching that, or even slightly earlier, along with my doctoral student Jennifer Peterson, we began a series of interviews with stakeholders and also with managers. And so we ended up, as I said, focusing on action and adoption levels. And really what we're talking about here is we ended up interviewing 33 people. For the shortest interview was a half an hour. The longest ended up going 2.5 hours. So the amount of data that you get out of 33 interviews is astonishing. And the number of pages of transcript are really more than Jennifer wanted to handle. And so we're still, it seems like a relatively small sample, but we again where we were beginning, so we shot off at that point. So let's now see what do the data tell us about these awareness and et cetera. Well, for the awareness, really what we're interested in understanding here, as I mentioned, is do people understand that there's a problem? And looking at this graph, one of the first things is that we did not ask, do you understand there's a problem with sagebrush steppe ecosystems? We asked generally about, well, how would you rate the overall health of Great Basin ecosystems? And obviously some people don't have a clue, and so there was a don't know category. But most people answered it, whether or not they had a clue or not. And what we see, though, is that it's tending toward the belief that the systems are healthy. And so when I first looked at these results, I thought, oh gosh, well, this is an interesting question. Are we in a situation where people are unaware of the threats that are posed to sagebrush steppe in this region or not? It's also, though, I also noticed something that if you look at this rural residents, the mean response on these sort of, if you went with a 1 to 4 scale from very unhealthy to very healthy, the mean response is actually closer to the healthy range for rural residents than for urban residents. And this is even more interesting because you would expect, perhaps, the rural citizens, who are more likely to live within sight of sagebrush, would be more aware of the decline of sagebrush steppe communities. And yet, in fact, they rated them as even healthier. And so this sort of puzzled me for a little bit. But then I look a little deeper, and we look at some of the other survey results. Now we ask them specifically about, what do you think are the threats to healthy rangelands? And we had a series of things from sort of what we might call, I think we had overly dense stands of sagebrush, were actually how it was written as something they could rate, and basically what we have here is that, it's high threat, moderate threat, slight threat, or not a threat, or how we put it up. And what I've done is I've given you the percentages of people who say it was either a large threat or a moderate threat. And so basically what we have here is that rural citizens are more likely than urban citizens to identify what we might call biological threats, change in the system characteristics themselves, juniper and pinyon encroachment, increasing density and decadence of sagebrush stands. They're more likely to say those are issues. Everybody seems to agree that wildfire and invasive species pose a threat to healthy rangelands. And then on the bottom we've got 3, and there are actually more of these, but I chose these 3 because they were representative. Overgrazing, off-highway vehicles, and development. And in every single one of those cases, urban residents saw them as greater threats than rural residents. And that begins to tell me that what's going on here to some extent is not simply an awareness, but when you're asking people to say, are rangelands healthy, rural citizens may be more likely to say, I've got some responsibility for this. Urban people are more likely to blame management for threats to rangelands. Rural people are more likely to blame nature for threats to rangelands. And when you think about it, well, the rural people are more closely tied to management. So psychologists might call this cognitive dissonance. It's really hard to accept the possibility that some of the threats might have to do with the things we're doing. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to say that rangelands are unhealthy, but that doesn't necessarily mean they aren't willing to accept and even promote the kinds of activities that would be likely to assist in the restoration of sagebrush. So let's move to the acceptance level. And we had a series of questions that asked people essentially to try and summarize it, synthesize in a little title was hard, but we gave them a set of choices of when is it acceptable to use this. These are whenever managers think it's appropriate, under some circumstances, no because it's not needed, no because those practices would be bad for the land, and don't know. So what I'm going to present to you are the people who who basically said either it's sometimes acceptable or it's always acceptable. And among the practices we had on there, we had a couple others, but were fire, chainsaw cutting, what in Utah we call bullhog treatment, but apparently it's supposedly called maceration, herbicide application, and mowing. And we recognize you can't use all of these on every site. And so here what we see is, first of all, the people who say it either is always or sometimes acceptable is pretty high, both urban and rural. So fire, about 80% of our citizens on both sides say it's at least sometimes it's appropriate to use wildfire as a management tool to restore sagebrush steppe systems. Mowing and felling, so two mechanical treatments, come in somewhat less, but they're statistically, the numbers over here show statistical significant differences, but still they're less than fire, but they're about equal. And then we have the two sort of bad things to do, chaining and herbicide, but even under chaining and herbicides in rural areas, a significant majority of people say these might be appropriate to use. And when you sort of combine the averages, chaining is the only one that came in actually as an average under 50% when we combine the whole citizenry together. So again, there are some rural and urban differences are primarily on the last two, where rural people are more willing to accept a wider range of tools in the toolbox. But acceptance is only one piece of the problem. Colleague Bruce is very interested in trust. He thinks that's a really important variable we should be studying and understand the human dimensions of natural resource management. And so we asked the same set of methods, which we had described in paragraphs so they'd understand what we were talking about. We said, which of these do you trust managers of public lands or management of rangelands to be able to use these tools effectively for restoration? What we find is that in all cases, trust levels were less than acceptability, and the greatest gap in trust is for prescribed fire, which doesn't really surprise me given the publicity that surrounds when the very rare time when a mistake is made. Okay, so let's move up to the action side. Here we're looking at the interviewee results. This comes from the work that Jen Peterson and I did. Here, when we get to the level of the involved public, clearly people understand that there is a need for restoration. So at this level, there's nobody out there who appears to be involved, that we could identify that participates in sagebrush steppe restoration practices and decision-making processes in the Great Basin that does not agree that there is restoration need. Including some people who may nonetheless take action to block those practices from being used. And this one even shocked me more, we really found widespread willingness to consider any treatment method. So what I had anticipated prior was that some segments of the stakeholder public would say, no, we can't use this. And then perhaps some managers would say, no, we can't use this. Although in that case, perhaps not so much because they don't believe it's feasible, but because they don't believe, or ecologically possible and it might be beneficial, but that it would be politically feasible. But we didn't really find that. And there was a couple of people who said no herbicides. One group that said grazing could not possibly be part of the solution. But in general, we didn't hear as much opposition to treatments as we expected. And in fact, that's why we're doing a content analysis, because I'm puzzled because what their statements to us are different from what they sometimes have said in other public fora. So I'm trying to tease that out a little more right now. They did, however, tend, just like the general public, they did tend to prefer mechanical treatments over chemical treatments. Environmentalists also told us that they would oppose treatment if the primary objective of treatment was to increase forage for livestock. And in fact, one of the biggest trust issues that we have right now is that there are people who are using the term restoration to mean increased forage production, and there are other people who are using the term restoration to mean something else. And in the debate right now, so what that does is it leads to some confusion or some assumption of hidden agendas on the part of others who may have different kinds of ideas about why we should be restoring these systems. Stakeholders also, like the public in our surveys, doubted agency capability to accomplish restoration goals. One of the benefits of doing interviews is now we can begin to probe further and find out, well, what in the world does this mean? Well, the first thing is this concern about the agency's ability to be able to effectively restore sagebrush steppe systems was found across all. I didn't mention this before. We had 4 categories of stakeholder that we focused on. So we tried to get what social scientists call saturation, which is where you seem to be getting as much. New interviews don't seem to be providing you with a whole lot of new information, so you're kind of saturated with information, with data. We wanted to achieve saturation in 4 different segments of the involved public, and that would be, so we had the sort of education extension segment of stakeholders, we had the livestock production segment of stakeholders, we had recreation, so hunting OHV section of stakeholders who participate in range management, political processes, public processes, and then an environmental group sort of section. And so all 4 categories we found the same thing. We are not convinced that the agencies are going to be able to get this done. Well, why? Well, first of all, stakeholders, not surprisingly, were uniformly more negative about the current and future of the agency's ability to manage anyway than the managers themselves. And we would hope for that. I mean, not because we want the stakeholders to be negative, but because we want the managers to be positive. But what the managers and the stakeholders agreed was that there isn't enough money out there. And what we heard a lot was really what they're focusing on was post-fire rehabilitation. There isn't even enough money to rehab. So how are we ever going to get to restoration? And that's actually, I've already said that. So the agencies are too busy being reactive to be able to be proactive, regardless of what they want to do. Because there's so much, at this point, the system has gotten so out of whack in the Great Basin that we simply don't have the ability to get ahead of anything. But this other thing in the middle I wanted to come back to. There's a widespread perception that decisions made by people on the ground will be impeded by folks at someplace else in the hierarchy, because just like ecosystems, governmental systems are also arranged hierarchically, and that at higher levels, or at, whether politically there's going to be interference, so that the best science, and they didn't necessarily agree what best science was, but they all said we should use it. The best science was not going to drive things, but in fact there was going to be someone, some other, in a state office, in a regional office, in Washington, D.C., or in some environmental group who was tied to someone in Washington, D.C., who was going to make it impossible for our good friend, the manager on the ground, to be able to do what he or she knows is right. And that is a widespread perspective about restoration. And that perspective is one that's really going to guide our ability to accomplish things. So I'm going to come back to that later. How about the managers? What are they telling us? Well, obviously, especially in the current political climate where statements that appear in print can come back to bite you, we're not entirely sure whether, sometimes it sounded as though the managers were clearly speaking from the heart. Sometimes it sounded as though they were clearly speaking from the script. And so, but what we think is going on, managers clearly agreed that funding was inadequate. They do like more local autonomy, although few of them actually blamed higher-ups for for decisions that were made, at least on something that with a tape recorder running. And they uniformly expected that no matter what they did, the few environmental groups, and by few I may mean one, will obstruct any efforts to treat sagebrush systems. And I don't think that's fair, but that's the perception. It's entirely fair, but that's the perception. And because of that, one of the things that also was interesting and maybe significant to you folks is that while managers said they would prefer us to use the largest scale projects possible, and there's two reasons for this. One is because the processes tend to occur, disturbances tend to occur at larger scales. Things occur at the landscape scale. Smaller projects are irrelevant. The second thing, though, is that it costs you just as much in terms of time and effort gained to do NEPA for a 50-hectare project as it does for a 10,000-hectare project. And therefore, if I'm going to have to go through this, I'd rather do it big, so I can actually affect some landscape. And so, but what happened, though, is that the citizens told us the opposite. The involved publics told us, we want to see the smallest possible project that you can get away with. And the reason for that is because in their minds, this is still risk, there's uncertainty. We know that management, human intervention in the past has had negative consequences for the land. While we understand that human intervention in the future is probably necessary in order to be able to get us back on track, we also know that people screw it up, and so the smallest possible way is going to give us the least likely that we're going to end up with a really major train wreck. And so we have a disconnect between the kinds of projects that the involved publics want to see us make and what the managers want to do. And that, again, can lead to an important thing for us to think about. Okay, but let's move now to the third part of this project, which is this idea about finding the shades of gray. Steve had a really cool picture in there once where he had this sort of, I won't call it a checkerboard, we'll call it a chessboard. It's a much more erudite presentation. He had a chessboard of 16 different photographs of sagebrush habitats, I think it was, all of which were different. Well, the same is true for the citizens, the human dimension. There are at least that many different kinds of human dimension, and we need to understand a little bit about the subtleties, and we need to expect that there are going to be differences. So in order to sort of set the stage for this, I want to go back to actually defining restoration, which we haven't done yet. And I got this from the Dictionary of Forestry, because I'm actually a recovering forester. And unlike Mike Coons, I have not been quoted in the newspaper as calling them little trees. But nonetheless, I fall back on my forestry background, and foresters describe restoration as I think most of us would, as the process of returning ecosystems or habitats to their original structure and species composition. And this is really kind of interesting because a couple things. One is it doesn't say anything about function, it only says anything about structure, and that's probably a reflection on forestry as a profession. And it also says original, which is like, okay, what does original mean? Well, if I think original means, in some cases it's pretty easy to say, I can accept that. So this is so over here we have, a 1963 photo that Robin Tausch from the U.S. Forest Service in Reno took of a mountain range in western Nevada. And this is the same location, same shot. And you can see that there's been a clear increase in the density of pinyon juniper over that period of time. And so, given that juniper is not all that exciting to people anyway, it might be fairly easy for people to say, yeah, I can see where, this would be a threat to sagebrush. I can see why it would make sense to knock it back. Now let's take this form of restoration. This is an area where I happen to be working in southwestern Montana in Steve's map. I think it was in the 15 to 30%, or no, 25 to 50% cover range, somewhere in there, as cover is described by landscape ecologists. And so here we have a very different, this may well be, probably is the kind of sagebrush habitat we used to have in that location. now we have a different sort of interloper. This is Douglas fir. It's charismatic megaflora. And it's, you see up here, you can see it sort of marching happily down the hillside here, and it's affecting, among other things, not only is it affecting habitat for wildlife and other things, it's also affecting the hydrology of these systems, and so that's become, and it's also increasing fuel load. So this is of interest to the land managers. And so, but if I were to now go out and say, gosh, we would like to restore this dysfunctional system and move it back to this functional system, you're going to maybe get a slightly different kind of response. So restoration is not restoration. We can't think of it that way. Acceptance and action for sagebrush steppe restoration is likely to depend on what it is that we're restoring and what we are disrestoring, how it is to be achieved, and why it is to be restored, and how those various ideas are presented and described. While obviously you have to tell the truth, how you do that and how understanding more about the citizens, what they're responsible to, can help us understand how to describe what we're trying to do in a way that is more likely to gain acceptance or action as we might desire. So let's look through those in turn. So first I'm arguing that acceptability of restoration will depend on what it is to restore and what will be removed to get there. So is the desired or natural condition, to go back to the definition, more or less preferred than the existing or degraded condition? And notice the difference. Those are two different ways to say the same thing, and they may elicit different responses from people. Would an alternative, not so natural condition meet the objectives of local landowners or publics? Restoration definitions aren't necessarily the same, and how one gets to the ultimate goal may involve some steps that aren't natural. So we'll hear from Val Anderson this afternoon. Some of us will hear about assisted succession as a potential, where essentially we're talking about non-native plants as a first step, eventually getting to the ability to restore a native system. And there are some people who would say that's just wrong, because it's not native. Other people might say that that's the only way to do it. I already mentioned the Milford Flat wildfire. It's the largest recorded in Utah. There was extensive loss of livestock and of forage. And so a lot of people now are thinking, how do we get the forage back? Other people are saying, how do we get the system in a place where it won't burn the same way? Those are not the same question, but most people both of them might call it restoration. And in fact, the governors of Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, and Nevada have declared war on cheatgrass. And near as this happened about a month and a half ago, and near as I can tell, the primary tool that they see as doing that is increasing grazing. Other people might say that's not the tool at all. There are other issues. So, which of these two photographs is more attractive? Over here we have, this nice picture. Here we have this sort of shrubby, messy thing here. And what do we have? We have this nice sort of purplish sagebrush waving in the breeze. I mean, not sagebrush, purplish cheatgrass waving in the breeze, a little bit of sagebrush hanging on, and some juniper in the middle. For a lot of people, this may be a really pleasant landscape that they wouldn't mind at all keeping. This one maybe not so. Or, if it burns, do I care which grass replaces it? Or do I, how do I learn this? Well, another one of the scientists who worked in Steve's lab, Cindy Salo from the USGS in Boise a few years ago, we got this idea that we wanted to gather expert knowledge, that we thought it would be really valuable to understand how different sorts of people with expertise about sagebrush and buntgrass systems, how they understood the need to do some sort of reseeding after a fire. And when did they decide whether rehabilitation was necessary or restoration? And when did they not? And so we gathered a workshop with people, and we spent a day in Boise, with a bunch of different people from different sort of dimensions of range management, and we asked them some questions. And at one point, one of the people who was a manager for a large landholding people who owns an awful lot of land and runs a lot of livestock in southern Idaho said, well, you know what? Sometimes I don't care if it comes back to cheatgrass, because sometimes what I really want is some early forage. And Cindy's response was, because she was being paid to get rid of the Antichrist seeds. But for me, I was like, my first response was, wow, there's way different ways to describe appropriate condition. And as Steve pointed out, there's a lot of different ways you can look at the ideal sagebrush ecosystem. And for some people, it might have some early forage in it. How about this issue of natives? Well, this comes from a study that Alan Rasmussen and I did a number of years ago, where we surveyed people in Utah about several issues related to range management. But one of them was we asked the question, well, when is it appropriate to use non-native seed in a restoration and rehabilitation program? And so what we find here is that only a very, very tiny proportion of the public said it's never appropriate to use non-native plants. And they weren't really all that excited about economics as a reason. They thought, well, just spend whatever it takes, as long as it doesn't cost me anything. But up here we have sort of this, you couldn't get natives, or non-natives are best for the objective. So they're saying, well, there might be times when the best thing to do is non-natives, and we understand that. We don't know much more about it. We didn't really give them any objective. We did give them one objective, which was to improve forage. And here's the only place where we saw rural and urban differences. Here, and it's about half the people said this is okay, but city folks were less likely to think natives were okay for forage, or non-natives were okay for increasing forage, and in a rehabilitation project. So this begins to get us at some of the discrepancies we might see between rural and urban publics. So the next one is how are we going to get there? And I really have already pretty much given you a lot of that data. There's some differences in how people respond to different treatments. So people, let's say fire better than mechanical better than mechanical that doesn't involve a bulldozer and a big chain is better than mechanical that does, or herbicide application. And this is something that's really seen across the board, although the differences are greater in urban citizens. Who influences the restoration plan also matters. Whose expertise is being sought? One of the big issues, another thing we heard a lot was they need to do a better job of involving local people in decision making. Well, what do you mean by local people? Well, a lot of times what you mean is not them environmentalists from Reno or from Salt Lake or from Haley. So local people are those who are most effective. But for other folks, it's, the expertise also resides in folks who are not permittees, who are not actively involved in management, who are actively involved in appreciation, and spend a lot of time in these systems. And so again, we heard a lot of people saying that there needs to be more expertise brought into it. And if you leave one of those forms of expertise out, then it becomes more difficult to achieve your objective. The third piece of this is, why is it being restored? This, depending on how we present the reasons, is going to affect how people respond to it. For some people, nature for nature's sake is fine. We should be doing it because it's the right thing to do, because native is always better than non-native, because all the components of ecosystems are better than some of the components of ecosystems. And some people say, well, that resonates for some people. For others, it does not. If restoration produces harvestable products, as I suggested before, some people will be suspicious of their motives, simply because there is an assumption that if we do something that will benefit people, it is somehow a lower form of value than if we do things purely for the biosphere. And so they assume that really that's the only purpose. So this sort of idea of trying to achieve multiple objectives, in some cases, is seen by folks as an evidence that you're really trying to only achieve one objective. And to some extent, the natural resource professional responsible for this, we're the ones who use the term multiple use to mean uses, economic uses for a long time, and that's changed, but it was the case until certainly the 60s. So the goals will matter, whether we're talking about restoring at-risk ecological communities, at-risk wildlife species, or whether we're talking about forage loss. In the Northern Rockies, when we talk about stream flows, it's different than if we're talking about wildfire hazard. Some of the people have suggested in some of the initial discussions I had, why are you so worried about fuel loads in a place where hardly anybody lives anyway? And how a project is presented affects its success. So I like the idea. We use these three terms to talk about vegetation change: expansion, encroachment, or invasion. We like the term encroachment when we're talking about woody species. So, because these species have been present at lower densities for thousands of years. Invasion when it's things that haven't been present for thousands of years. So we use invasion for non-natives, encroachment for undesirable processes, and native plants, expansion for neutral or desirable processes. I'm interested to know, I don't know, whether that really matters. It seems to matter to us. But it may affect how these are presented, may affect how other people respond to it. So finally, what do I think we can learn from this? This is where we get to the sheer speculation part. Well, it's clear that awareness of the problem exists, but there are some discrepancies between what the threat level that we may perceive and that other people do. Urban citizens tend to be more pessimistic about rangelands in general, more likely to blame past and ongoing management for those problems. Rural responses may in fact reflect a disconnection between their ideas about invasive species, which they recognize are out there, and overall health, which they feel is pretty good. Acceptance is pretty high, and willingness to accept multiple tools was surprisingly high. I think there's places we can work in. But many people doubt the agency's ability to succeed. Action is a little harder to predict. There are some interest groups that are going to block restoration due to mistrust. Others are willing and ready to help. And many of you know already who those are, but it helps to try and cultivate all kinds of different approaches. And adoption will occur if the right conditions exist, but there's an awful lot of skepticism that society or government is willing to let it happen. So now what? Where do we go with all this? What do I think is going on? Were there any sort of take-home points I'd like you to have? And the answer is, yeah. One is that the social climate for restoration really is pretty good. Disturbance events are inevitable. And I'm using disturbance events in quotes because I would like us to think about social and political disturbance as disturbance events as well. Just as we continue to go forward and manage knowing that there might be a wildfire, there might be a bark beetle outbreak if there's any foresters in the room, that some other kind of disturbance event is likely to happen. And yet we plug on and we assume it's part of our calculations. Well, I would argue that the diversity of involved publics and the different kinds of groups that are involved can also be thought of various levels of disturbance agent. Some of them only cause a disturbance infrequently. Some of them are more frequent and maybe more catastrophic. And yet we continue to plug on. We don't say, I'm not going to bother to try and do something because so-and-so might not appreciate it. But at the same time, we work to try and reduce the disturbance hazard in ecological systems, and we should do the same in political and social systems. And that means building trust. And the way you build trust is through openness of process and through demonstration so people can see that what you're doing is not causing as much problem as they might have been led to believe. Many citizens believe that agencies aren't open enough. That came out in the parts of Bruce's study I didn't mention. The only way to do this is to keep listening and to listen in different ways and to make it more clear that you're listening, to make it easier, as easy as you possibly can, to make people understand that you've listened, that you've heard, that you've tried to account for something. Demonstration projects need to be visible. There's a tendency for us to try and hide things, and we do that for two reasons. One, because people are less likely to disrupt an experiment or something, and two, if it has a negative effect, it's not next to the road. The problem is they need to be accessible and they need to be informative. It's not enough to take people out once a year on a field trip. There needs to be interpretation. There needs to be a working relationship between the resource shop and the rec shop to figure out how to help people who are going to pass places to understand what's going on. And I know all of this is happening. I just would like to see it happen more. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
You asked questions about acceptance of treatment. Did you also ask about acceptance of management changes, such as linking treatments with reduction of overgrazing, or the issue of acceptance of reducing fragmentation by roads and routes?
The question was, when we talked about acceptance of treatments, did we also ask about linking treatments with management practices, such as reducing fragmentation through road closures, or linking changes in grazing management with treatments? We did not get to that level of complexity in a survey. I agree wholeheartedly that those are parts of the story, and I really think that we need to figure out how to get there. But with the kind of we were really maxing out our ability to ask citizens, to respond to things with just describing that. So I really don't. I think we could do that in a sort of focus group type of approach, but not in a survey.
Because I think a lot of conservation or environmentalist concerns about treatments is that it's in a vacuum, not connected to changing management that contributed to the problem.
Context is what it's all about. And I think you're right that a lot of people's responses have to do with if they think the treatment is just magic bullet and then you don't do anything else, it's not part of an overall change. When I'm talking about adoption, I'm talking about more than simply implementing treatments. I'm talking about management change.
But you've only asked questions about acceptance.
Well, I only asked the general public questions about acceptance. In some of the interviews, we did go beyond that. Yes.
Is there a formula in social science? By the way, it's an interesting talk, where the outreach to the more recalcitrant stakeholders one of the things we try to do is keep reaching out and meet with people. You try to talk with people. But is there a point where you give up on that, or is there a return on the investment you can measure, or when sometimes it's instinct, but we put a lot of effort into reaching out to people we know will litigate. But do you just give up, or do you just persist and persist?
The question is there a point at which you give up on outreach to recalcitrant groups who would prefer to litigate and who simply aren't going to trust the land managers? And the realistic answer is sometimes that happens, but honestly, quitting is telling them that they're right. And so, I know that it's like we continue to reach out, and when we don't, we find ourselves in trouble. And I can just examine here. Let's take. This is part of why I talk about shades of gray. But let's take environmental group. There are conservation environmental groups that are working with the Sagebrush Stage Step project, who are actually working with us to implement treatments and see what happens. There are other organizations that have sued to block the implementation of treatments in one case. And so, but part of why that happened is because by which I take primary responsibility as the person in charge of outreach, did not do a good enough job up front to tell them what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it. But when I did try to do that, and several of us did, they responded, no, that's a bunch of crap, you're from Land Grant University, all you really want to do is increase the amount of area for cows. So, my frustration level was high, but I still admit that we need to keep in contact with them, and we make sure that they continue to be, that we speak to them as much as possible. So.
We better stop here. Thank you very much, Mark. It was a very interesting talk.